Yes. So thank you, Tony, for that. And thank you, everyone, for sticking around until the end. There's a certain amount of irony in the fact that your attention abilities will be the lowest since this is the last talk of the day. But I'm still excited to tell you some of our latest results about what the brain waves that we're collecting from the participants say about attention in those with 22q. So I know Tom introduced this a little bit earlier, but I want to review briefly what we're talking about when we're talking about brainwaves. So as many of you probably know from your biology classes, the brain is made up of a special type of cell, and these cells are called neurons. And the thing that's so special about these cells is that they use electricity to communicate with each other. And when we put a special head cap on a participant or on me, we can measure this electricity with a special cap, and that's called EEG. And what we'll be looking at here are these signals that we pick up from the EEG cap related to a particular event. So, for example, this might be seeing an angry face. And when we do that, that's called an event-related potential, or an ERP, or an ERP is something I'll sometimes call it. And the reason we like to use these is if we're giving the participants an activity where they're seeing these angry faces, from the behavior we're missing a lot of things that happen in the brain between when they see that face and when they press the button. But with this cap, we can get a lot more information about all the different cognitive processes that are happening between there. So the processes we're particularly trying to look at, the first one is attention. And everyone kind of knows what attention is, but you might not necessarily put a definition to it. So attention for us is how you're selecting the important bits to focus on in a busy world. And this is something we all struggle with, not just teens or teens with 22q. We might be at work trying to focus on whatever we're doing on our laptop, and then suddenly our buddy Dave has something to say, and oh, our attention's captured by that. And our brain is using different circuits for these two types of attention. The other process that we'll be looking at is something called response inhibition, which maybe isn't as much of a term we throw around in day-to-day life. And response inhibition is when you're holding back from doing something that you have a strong urge to do. For example, I come to work every day, and at the end of the day, usually I drive straight home. And so that's a very strong habit for me. So if I have to stop off at the grocery store, I might find, oh, darn it, I accidentally drove myself home. And so that's one example where it's something that you have a strong habit of doing, but this can be any type of response that you're inhibiting. It could also be something social or emotional. So why do we care about these two processes? So teens in general, but especially those with 22q, often have trouble controlling their attentional focus. So, for example, they might be paying attention to their phone when they should be paying attention to their teacher. They also teens can have trouble controlling their actions. So where an adult might be able to ignore that phone buzzing in their pocket, the teen gets it out and looks at it. And we often think about this trouble controlling actions with regard to kind of like risky behavior when we're talking about teens, and that's certainly part of this. But we're also talking about just someone who can't stop saying, "Are we there yet?" when they're driving in the car. The other thing that's important is anxiety may increase these difficulties. So someone who is anxious might have more trouble controlling their attention and their responses, especially to emotional pictures or in emotional situations. And so I know earlier today, Tom introduced the fact that a lot of the individuals with 22q might have some math difficulties. And so for a lot of these kids and teenagers, math class, for example, is actually kind of an emotional situation, because if you know that you have difficulty with something, then you're kind of in an emotional situation there. So then you might have more trouble controlling your attention and your responses in that class. And this is also something that this kind of loss of attentional control may relate to some of like the ADD and ADHD diagnoses that we see in this population. So another important note I want to make on the data that we're about to look at is we are working with teenagers, and all of the things we're talking about are things that teenagers in general are struggling with. This isn't just those with 22q. Teens in general are at a phase in their life where they have this kind of social imperative to be increasing their peer group. And so they tend to be distracted by emotional, especially social images and situations. However, we do want to see if those with 22q are struggling with this a little bit more so that we can plan the right interventions for them. And of course, also important to note is we are still seeing participants, as Hannah brought up. So these will keep getting updated as we see more and more people. So the first activity is a test of attention. So in this one, the experimenter, likely Hannah, will tell the participant, press the button to a specific color. Say, press the button to red in the center of the screen. Press a different button for any other color in the center of the screen. But you need to ignore the circles on the side. So those circles are there to distract them. And the other thing about this activity is it goes pretty quickly, and the color you're looking for is pretty uncommon. So you really do need to use close attention in order to do this successfully. And part of why this activity was picked for our study was it was used in a previous study looking at young adults with and without schizophrenia. And of course, no one in this 12 to 18-year-old age bracket has schizophrenia. We're not trying to say that at all, but we do know that some of the symptoms between these two populations are related. So it might also be that the activities that were sensitive in that population are also sensitive here. And what was seen in that previous study was that the adults without diagnoses were able to control their attention and avoid getting distracted. However, those young adults with schizophrenia weren't able to control their attention and got distracted by the lateral circles. So of course, we also have the emotional version for this, and in the emotional version, we ask them to press the button to a specific emotion, either happy, calm, or angry. And we want to see if the teenagers have more trouble controlling their attention when the images are emotional rather than the circles. So there's a lot going on here, so I'm going to break it down. So this is looking at our behavior. This isn't looking at the brain waves yet. And the reason for that is even though obviously there's a lot of advantages to looking at the brain waves, if the brain is doing something and it's not affecting the behavior, it's not clear we really care from an intervention perspective. So what we're looking at here is when you have a distractor, how much worse is that making your performance? So all of these bars go down because everyone is worse when there's a distractor on the screen. And you can see, so here these two are where there are circles. In general, those with 22q are having a little bit more trouble around distractors than those who are typically developing. This is particularly true in the case of angry faces. The teens with 22q are really struggling when there's angry face distractors. However, you also notice that even the teens who are typically developing are having a lot of distraction to the happy distractors. And again, this relates to kind of this social imperative, forming your peer group, and happy faces are really important to you as a teenager. So it makes sense that they'd be distracted by those. Okay, so looking at some brainwaves, some ERPs. And this is kind of a lot to put in our own brains, so I'll say at the beginning and at the end of this slide, if you can't remember anything else from this, remember negative means distraction, positive means suppression of that distractor. So what we can look at with this is, let's say we're trying to figure out whether or not someone's brain is looking at this red square. And we can look at that by looking at the electrodes on the opposite side of the screen from that, or the same side of the screen from that. Probably be pretty different on my head. And when we subtract those, we get a difference wave. So here red is opposite side, green is same side, and this is the difference, and it's going negative. So that would mean someone's paying attention to something on the side of the screen. If they aren't supposed to be paying attention to it, that means they're distracted by it. You can also look at the same thing, but now if the contralateral ones are higher up, then you'd get a positive different wave. And when you see that positive difference wave, that means they're suppressing that distractor. So again, negative, they're getting distracted by that thing to the side. Positive, they're suppressing that distractor. And these are some actual waveforms that we're seeing from our participants. So in the pink square, we have our participants who have 22q. In our blue square, we have our participants who are typically developing. And here, the legend got a little small, but we have our black opposite side of the screen and red same side of the screen. and blue is the difference wave. And the blue one is what we really care about. And the reason I like to show this is to show that this really is a small and subtle effect that we're looking at. So if you had a child who came and participated with us, they might have said, "Oh, that activity was so long. I'm so tired." And the reason it's so long is we really need a lot of examples of these brainwaves, and that's also why we need to see so many participants in order to really identify these signals. So this is looking at the non-emotional attention version, so just with the circles. And what we're seeing here is kind of a confirmation of this greater difficulty controlling attention in the teens with 22q. Because what we're seeing here is those with 22q are showing more of that distraction component and less of that suppression component. Whereas those who are typically developing are showing more of the suppression and less of the distraction. And so this seems to kind of confirm what we were thinking based on previous studies, that this might actually be a sensitive marker for us to look at. And again, as we mentioned earlier, since we will be seeing these teens again, well, some of them won't be teens anymore, in 2.5 years, seeing if this is predictive of any of these factors of risk or protection for symptoms. But again, what happens when we look at emotion? So here we're breaking it down with distraction on top and suppression on the bottom. And what we're seeing is in the teens who are typically developing, they're getting a lot more of this distraction component with regard to the faces than they are with regard to the circles. Whereas the teens with 22q are pretty much getting this distraction across the board. But when we look at suppression, the teens with 22q are actually kind of suppressing these angry and happy face distractors. So we think this might be related to kind of what Hannah was saying earlier about how they might want to actually avoid looking at these faces if they're anxious about social things. Whereas those who are typically developing are kind of able to suppress everything. So it seems like, yes, they get distracted initially by these angry and happy faces, but then they're able to pull it together and kind of suppress those in order to complete the activity. And I think the suppression in those with 22q is also kind of related to this almost idea of like throwing on the brakes in response to a social stimuli. So I think it's a good segue to go into with regard to our response inhibition tasks, since this is kind of throwing on the brakes in response to something as well. So for this one, if you were here 2 years ago, I made you all do this activity. I decided that this year you probably didn't want that much audience participation, but they'll see 1, 3, or 5 of these little mole guys, and they have to press the button to the mole, but do nothing when they see the vegetable. And so the story is the mole is digging up your garden, so you want to press the button to the mole, but you don't want to squash your vegetables. And then we also have our emotional face version. So for this one, you'll have to press the button to the emotional faces, but not to the calm faces. And Courtney made up a cute little story for them about this, where you're a photographer taking pictures of people making emotional faces. And typically, so as Tony mentioned, one reason that we're doing some of these activities is there's a lot of data on how typical teens who are typically developing perform in these. And usually what you see is teens who are typically developing perform worse on the emotional go, no go to the happy faces. So again, looking at behavior first. So these are going back to the box plots that Hannah and Courtney introduced. So what you'll see is in general, those with 22q are performing worse than those who are typically developing on this activity. And the biggest difference is after the most moles. So after you've seen 5 moles, then you have to not press to a vegetable. The teens who are typically developing are doing much better than those who have 22q. So we're going to focus on this situation. And here we're looking at just how does emotion affect you? And I named this a cost graph because I had initially expected that everyone would do worse to emotion. But what we actually see is though those who are typically developing are showing worse performance when the faces are emotional, those who have 22q are actually performing a little bit better when the faces are emotional than they are when they're looking at these moles and vegetables. And this is why I think this is so related to this kind of idea of throwing on the brakes is, for example, if you're walking in the woods and you see a butterfly, it's harder to throw on the brakes and stop walking to that than if you're walking in the woods and you see a snake. And so if the teens with 22q are a little bit anxious about these faces, that's probably why it's easier for them to throw on the brakes and not do this habitual response to them. So for this, we're looking at another little ERP component, and this is called the N2. And it's associated with what's called conflict monitoring, which is a signal in the brain telling you, do something different than you've been doing. And this component is often larger in patients who have anxiety, and it's also often larger when you are having better performance on this type of activity. And when we look at our different versions of activity, we say no difference in conflict monitoring component in the cold version with the moles and the vegetables. But we're seeing much bigger conflict monitoring component in the teens with 22q to the angry and the happy faces, which is consistent with the fact that these are the versions where they're doing a little bit better. It's also consistent with literature from patients with anxiety where they're having this component be larger when they're doing better on the activity. You can also see when looking across the different conditions that those who are typically developing are showing the largest conflict monitoring component to the moles, which is the task where they're doing the best. Whereas those with 22q are actually showing the largest one to angry, which is where they're kind of getting this big boost in performance. So it seems like with the people who we've seen so far in this activity, the teens with 22q are having some trouble controlling their attention, and this might be something sensitive that we're really looking for as we move forward with the study. The teens with 22q also seem to be avoiding those emotional faces and are also better at kind of watching out for them in the emotional go, no go, which that leads us to believe that the emotional stimuli might be particularly activating to those anxious teens with 22q. So of course, thank you to everyone who helped out with the study, particularly of course to all of the participants and their families, because we literally couldn't do it without you. So thank you so much for coming in and helping out.